So let's get started. I see it's 12 o'clock now, and I just wanted to remind everyone that this session is being recorded, which you've probably seen in the message that you received. So welcome to the first talk of the Medical Heritage Library's Spring Speaker Series. My name is Melissa Graff, and I'm a member of the Medical Heritage Library's Collaboration and Education Working Group, which organizes our fellowship program. The Medical Heritage Library is a collaborative digitization and discovery organization committed to providing open access resources in the history of healthcare and the health sciences. We aspire to be a visible, research-driven history of medicine and health community that serves a broad interdisciplinary constituency. Our goal is to make high quality content available online free of charge and to simplify and centralize the discovery of these resources. Before introducing our speaker today, I have two additional announcements on behalf of the Medical Heritage Library. Our first announcement is to please save the date for the next speaker in our spring speaker series. The title of the talk will be Ear Trumpets and Audiophones, a Summer in the Medical Heritage Library Collection. And the speaker is Rachel Gillibrand, who was our Medical Heritage Library Japrit Verdi Fellow in Disability Studies. The link will be put into the chat, and you're welcome to register for that. Our second announcement, if Asia, you're ready to turn the slide, Asia? Thank you. For our second announcement, be our next Medical Heritage Library Fellow. We are open to, our program is open for our next fellow to develop curated collections related to climate change, aging, or LGBTQ+. The fellowship that we are offering is a virtual fellowship, which will take place anywhere between May and August 2022. And the application deadline is March 28th. So if you would like to be a Medical Heritage Library virtual fellow this summer, please make sure to apply in time. The URL will be in the chat as well. Okay, we'll turn to the next slide. Okay, so it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker today. You can see clearly the title of the talk, Uncovering the Roots of Racism in Medicine, a Practice in Reading Against the Archival Grain. Our speaker is Dr. Asia Lanz, who completed her PhD in anthropology at Syracuse University in 2021, where she concentrated in the historical archaeology and cultural heritage preservation. Her dissertation traces the long history of violence against Black women in the United States by merging skeletal data and archival resources. These various archival traces shed light on the ways biocultural processes in the past continue to shape daily life, health, and well-being in the present. Asia is now postdoctoral researcher at Harvard University as part of the Inequality in America initiative. She continues to pursue decolonizing research while focusing on the ethics of museum collections, the objectification of human remains, and the history of race. Asia was also a Medical Heritage Library Fellow in 2021. So please help me welcome Dr. Asia Lanz. Thank you, Asia.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. You probably already saw Lolita. If I turn around, it's because my dog is harassing me, but I'll try to stick on topic. So today I'm going to be talking with you a bit about my dissertation research and how it influenced my time as a fellow for the Medical Heritage Library. And before we get going, I need to give a content warning. So we are talking about racism. So I'll have some mentions of offensive, outdated language, which comes up when doing these sorts of archival studies. Not working. Okay, so to get us going, we can talk about how we might define an archive. So I like the theoretical framework proposed by anthropologist David Zeitlin. He considers archives to be both repositories of material and the materials contained therein. He draws on the work of philosophers Foucault and Derrida, discussing the development of the archive and the potential for the archive to suppress and control certain groups. Archivists act as gatekeepers and power brokers in selecting which items become archived and the composition of the collections thereafter. However, what's important to keep in mind is that even if an archive is created for one purpose, we can use it for another. And this is often referred to as reading against the archival grain, which is how I do my research. So I'm trained as an archaeologist, and I like to think of myself as doing archaeology in a few different ways. So to start with, going off of our discussion of archives, we can think of archaeologies of knowledge, and this is coming from Foucault's archaeology of knowledge, where he argues we can excavate for hidden and silenced voices, and he's really looking at this as it's historiography of the systems of thought and of knowledge. So his notion of archaeology is viewing it as the sort of analytical tool for uncovering alternative histories and systems of knowledge. And we have to understand that the knowledge we accept as fact and true is actually, it's subjective and structured by certain people who are able to write history. I also am an archaeologist of the African diaspora. So if we think of, everything that happens after colonization and many folks, Black folks leaving Africa, oftentimes forced, so the forced migration of slavery to the New World, we have to think of the materiality of events, especially when it comes to the African diaspora. So some events leave material traces, and this could be something from, a physical body, it could be buildings, it could be data that we keep in censuses, something like monuments. But other events don't really leave these material traces behind. So if we're thinking about archaeological investigations of Black folks, particularly here in the United States, a lot of our communities and histories have been erased, arguably intentionally. So we can think of things like urban renewal after World War II that, built highways directly through Black communities intentionally. And so Black history is erased from the landscape, and it also erases our claim to the land and our claim to having history here in this country. And finally, archaeologies of the body. So I am trained as a bioarchaeologist. The simplest definition means someone who studies human remains from archaeological contexts. Many of these are housed in museums, which I'm going to talk about today. And I argue that these sorts of bodies and these museum collections are another form of archives, a skeletal archive. And perhaps by looking at these remains and considering why they've been curated and collected in museum and university collections, we can fill in some of the silences that are produced in some of our more traditional archives, such as, death certificates, censuses, maps, institution records, etc. So I inform my archival research from a few different vantage points, and here I'll just focus on a couple. So first, I'd like to point out, as my dog starts barking, Sherlock, stop it, that this image on the left is coming from a slave census in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I'm currently doing my postdoc. And I'm researching the lives and deaths of enslaved individuals here who've largely been erased from our history because we have this myth of New England as being a sort of place where slavery wasn't that big of a deal. But this slave census from 1754, right here, it shows, if you look closely, there were 33 males and 23 females, and they're simply enumerated. And so the work I'm doing right now is trying to actually name some of these people and figure out what happened to them. And I'd be happy to talk further about that in the Q&A. But to return to the research at hand using these skeletal archives in museums, I draw on the work of Trio, who wrote Silencing the Past, and he argues that archives are not neutral or natural, and he discusses the process of historical production and the making of archives in terms of silences. And so he points out that the presence and absences embodied in sources or artifacts, they're not neutral and natural, they're created. And what's very important from his work is that if you consider a group of people as incapable of something, such as Black people being incapable of certain acts or thoughts, then those with the power to construct archives and tell histories do so in a way that produces silences and recreates this ranking, this racial ranking of people. Secondly, I rely on the work of Marissa Fuentes, who goes in more on these silences in archives and talks about archival violence. She argues that the objectification of Black bodies, and particularly Black women's bodies, can be viewed through a lens of mutilated historicity. And she defines this as the violent condition in which enslaved women appear in the archive, disfigured and violated. And in many ways, their bodies and flesh become inscribed with the text and violence of slavery. And slavery obviously has echoes that have stuck with us to the present day. And so I take this in my investigations of Black women who may have been enslaved, some who were born after emancipation, and really take into account the ways that their histories and stories have been silenced and mutilated. So the skeletal archive that I'm working with here, so many biological anthropologists, bioarchaeologists such as myself, we use what are called identified skeletal collections for research. And these are often at museums and universities, and they contain remains that are usually treated as the anonymous dead that have specific data available to researchers, such as age and sex and cause of death. Only recently have we started calling in the ethics of these collections. So for example, the collection I work with, and this is a picture of how it's stored at the Smithsonian, I researched the Huntington collection. So this is a skeletal collection that consists of the anatomized skeletal remains of about, it was originally 3,600 individuals, and they were dissected in New York City at the College of Physicians and Surgeons at Columbia University during the Progressive Era, mainly, so between 1890 and 1920. And the thing is, these came from unclaimed bodies. So these are people who die in the city, and for whatever reason, they're either you can't afford to bury their remains, or perhaps you're a recent immigrant to the city, or your family is far away. Your body goes unclaimed, so it's turned over for medical dissection. So these people did not consent to dissection, and they did not consent to the remains being curated for study. So I focus on 79 women in the collection catalog who were classified as Black or Negro at the time of death. But instead of focusing only on skeletal data, as a biological anthropologist or bioarchaeologist might often do, I'm also working with more traditional forms of archival documents and arguing for the restoration of these individuals' names so that we can tell fuller life histories. So as per agreement with the Smithsonian, I will only use first names when I talk about some of these women, but I'd be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if there are questions. So again, the time period this collection comes from is the Progressive Era and early Jim Crow, which was present in the North too. And so what I'm really thinking about is, even though these women died at this period in time, their lives span over, their lives combined span over a century. So the earliest woman in this collection is born in 1806. The latest was a girl who died when she was only 12, and that was in the 1900s. The other thing we have to keep in mind when talking about these collections is, why they were amassed in the first place. So many of these collections, people ask, why am I studying dead bodies that are stored in a museum? The Huntington collection and many other skeletal collections, this is thanks to the work of Ales Hurlichka, a physical anthropologist who's considered the founder of our field. And Hurlichka was very interested in studying the different groups of man, to quote him. He says, physical anthropology is that part of the science which occupies itself with the body and its functions, investigating their differences, causes, modes of development, and tendencies from man's beginning and among his present multiple groups. And right here, especially this present multiple group. So he is he's a racist. He also describes eugenics as applied anthropology. So the science of race improvement or racial hygiene that eventually gives rise to the Holocaust. He would have been an early proponent of this science. And what's really important to note here is that early physical anthropology is closely tied to the medical field. So when I'm undertaking this work for the Medical Heritage Library, I see all of this overlap in authors and collaborations, and folks who are really on the cutting edge of race science, popping up throughout these medical archives. And folks like Herlichka would often focus on the poor, recent immigrants, and people of color, because you're trying to figure out who is abnormal, who is other, who is not white, essentially. So here's an example of one of the sources found in the Medical Heritage Library. And this is a publication by Herlichka called Physical Differences Between White and Colored Children. And so he's talking about, he says this, more stable differences of a physical nature which exist between white and Negro children. What is fascinating here is his use of the word stable. So race is actually a concept that is always in flux. And what these folks were trying to do was define race on these supposed immutable characteristics that were just inherent based on the color of your skin and your ancestry. And that is certainly not the case, as modern anthropologists have pointed out. You know, race is a social construct, but it does have real implications on our lived experiences. So now I'm going to jump into a couple examples of women from the Huntington collection, and then also relate it to some of the other sources I've identified in the Medical Heritage Library. So to begin with, let's talk about specimen number 317781. So this is a Black woman who died in 1893. Her body went unclaimed because she died in a public hospital. She is then dissected and her remains are kept for further study. And eventually they're brought to the Smithsonian through the work of Herlichka. Now, unfortunately, the circumstances of how this collection was made and how it was treated, it originally served as a sort of blending library for medical students at Columbia University. By the time it's sent to the Smithsonian, when its original curator has a decline in health, George Sumner Huntington, it has been essentially very mixed up and there's a lot of missing things. So in the case of 317781, if we're not given access to her name, all we have is a clavicle and a radius and ulna. In this case, they're from the left side. And here I'm making the decision to not show images of her actual skeletal remains. And that's, again, something I'd be happy to talk about if someone has questions about this. However, when I'm given more access to what has been, hidden away in our archives for this collection, her name is Annie. It turns out she was a lifelong resident of New York City, but I can't find any other documentary sources on her besides a death certificate, which is a very common problem with Black folks. We moved around, we were prevented from owning property, etc. And so you're not often going to find us in these traditional archives. However, I have part of her physical body and I do have her death certificate. The other thing I found is a birth certificate. So Annie is working in New York City until she dies in 1893 at the age of 19. Her last known address is the Colored Home and Hospital. And this is a segregated institution set up for poor Black folks, in particular women. She lived here for a month before she passed away, and her cause of death is I'm going to mess up this word, I always do, puerperal eclampsia and asthenia. Or in other words, she's dying due to complications of childbirth, including convulsions. It was often described during this time period, and exhaustion. We don't really use this diagnosis anymore, but in the mid-1800s to the 1900s, it was very common. So Annie dies in childbirth, but based on this birth certificate, her son lived. I don't know what happens to him after this. Perhaps he went to the Colored Home and Orphanage, and maybe I'll be able to track him down if he survived any longer past being an infant. But what comes to mind here is that to this day, Black women are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. So this chart here is motherhood mortality rates provided by the CDC. I'm not a big fan of this Hispanic origin category, which I will happily talk about if someone has questions about that. But what's really important here is that these women who are being raced as Black, were dying more frequently in childbirth. Meanwhile, here's a statue, an image of the statue of J. Marion Sims, who's considered the founder of modern gynecology. And this statue stayed up in New York City in Harlem, one of these historically Black neighborhoods, until 2018. And the only reason it's finally taken down is there are massive protests and people keep, and I'm saying this in quotes, vandalizing the statue. I would say they were improving it. So finally, the statue's removed and it's put near his grave. And so why are people protesting this? Because J. Marion Sims supposedly perfected his craft on the bodies of enslaved Black women. So here's an illustration by Robert Tom. And this is supposed to be, J. Marion Sims, and, he has these other white men with him, possibly medical doctors, maybe it's even enslavers. And it's an illustration of you can see these two Black women peeking around the curtain while he's examining, a third woman on the table. We now know the names of some of the enslaved women that he practiced on, including Lucy, Betsy, and Anarcha. They went unnamed for decades, but he performed multiple operations and procedures on them, and this is all before anesthesia. And then in 1855, he actually goes on to establish the first women's hospital in New York City. And so, this craft, if you will, is perfected using our bodies, and yet to this day, we're still suffering disproportionately from gynecological issues, and especially childbirth. So going back to the Medical Heritage Library archives, what I'd like to point out here is this, it's a fascinating sort of contradiction. So this resource right here on some of the apparent peculiarities of the parturition in the Negro race, with remarks on race pelvis in general. So anthropologists, being trained as an anthropologist, one of the parts of the body that is drilled into our heads is the pelvis, our os coxa, and we rely on them for a number of reasons. If we're trying to put people into biological sexual categories, of which we are limited to two, which I'd be happy to talk about the issues with that and how we're reinforcing certain notions of what it means to be a human and you can only be man or woman. But we're also really interested in the size of the birth canal, because how large heads are for human babies when we give birth. But what's really interesting is that, and to quote from this article here by Joseph Tabor Johnson, it has been the opinion of many men, myself included, that the negress gave birth to her children more easily than the white female, on account of her having a larger and more roomy pelvis. My attention has been drawn frequently to the graceful carriage of the well-dressed Negro and mulatto women in the streets, and their walk compared with that of white ladies, suggesting that they possess more narrow loins and hips than white women who, to use the expression of Meigs, waddle when they walk. And so this is this whole, I think if I recall, 40 pages where he goes back and forth on, we often find that Black women have larger hips, but do they really? And, it has this like thinly veiled sexual analysis of women in general, because one way you could get out your, sexual frustrations was hiding it in the guise of science and medicine. But what's really interesting here too is to talk about, during enslavement, Black women's childbearing ability was something that was valued because they're producing more labor and an item essentially for their enslavers. However, after emancipation, there's going to be this switch where Black women are supposedly spreading like multi-generational cultures of poverty, vectors of disease, and eventually we, evolve into the welfare queen. So it's interesting to think, which is it, and why are we dying in childbirth if not our pelvis, which is a whole other issue that we could talk about after if you're interested. So a lot of this ties into the Negro health problem in particular. So there are a lot of Negro problems throughout history that will come up in the United States. And essentially, they're all due to societal constraints, racism, segregation, etc. But instead, they're going to be blamed on Blackness and inherent characteristics associated with Blackness. So the Negro health problem in particular is really popularized by L.C. Allen in 1915. And he goes on to argue, it is undoubtedly true that the Negro race has deteriorated physically and morally since slavery times. In some ways, he is perhaps more intelligent, but freedom has not benefited his health nor improved his morals. So essentially, after emancipation, certain diseases become more prevalent in Black communities, especially diseases like rickets and tuberculosis. But instead of acknowledging that such illnesses are due to structural inequalities, including but not limited to discrimination, subpar segregated housing, poor working conditions, etc., you're going to accuse Black people of being vectors of disease due to a lack of moral and physical hygiene. And so, for example, here's something else from the Medical Heritage Library, this study by George N. Acker, MD, written in 1894. And it's rickets in Negroes. The Negro race presents so many peculiarities, and there are such physical differences between it and the white race that it's surprising that not more work has been done, et cetera, et cetera. And he goes into, if we can skim down, since the war, the race has been placed under entirely new conditions. It was to the interest of the master to see that the young were well taken care of. And so what he's saying essentially is that slavery was better for Black people because there were less cases of rickets, which we now know is vitamin D deficiency. And so essentially children end up with weak bones that can't support themselves. And I'll show you an image of this. But instead of looking at, what changed in their circumstances, it's easier to blame it on Black people themselves. So along with rickets, another disease that becomes, very common, tuberculosis. And here I'll shout out, there's an entire Medical Heritage Library resource set that talks about tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is of particular interest to me because it killed over half of the women I studied in the Huntington collection. And it's one of the few diseases that leaves mark on bone. So here we have a reverend writing for the American Society of Sanitary and Moral Prophylaxis in 1912. So this is part of a social hygiene movement that really takes off in the progressive era, where again, you're blaming people for their issues as though there's some sort of inherited innate condition, when in reality, these are social problems. And so this reverend, he has profound belief in the value of hell. And he sees its value in this tuberculosis campaign. It is by making people realize that tuberculosis is the hell provided for the sins committed against certain of the laws of nature, which God has given them. And that by understanding and obeying those laws, there's a way of escaping tuberculosis, and that is through virtue and obedience to laws. And then he goes into talk about venereal diseases, which he also attributes to moral characteristics. He's saying that, we need to essentially scare people into behaving better, and they will be, free of these diseases. And again, this is rather than acknowledging that a disease like tuberculosis, which is usually spread through respiratory, through coughing, in the old times, it's called things like consumption and phthisis. So basically you're coughing, you're wasting away. The disease was highly racialized. So when it's more common in Black people, it's seen as this sort of Negro tuberculosis that's, disgusting and unsanitary. However, at the same time, there are all of these romantic stories of, say, like young white women wasting away from tuberculosis while her lover pines for her. So these diseases are very racialized, both in who's becoming more ill with them and sick with them, but also then how we're blaming people for becoming sick. So again, here's an example. So on the left, this is an X-ray from Radiopedia. And this is what a child would look like with rickets. And so these are your leg bones. The top would be your femur, the bottom, your tibia and fibula. And what happens is if you are vitamin D deficient, you are not absorbing calcium, and your bones are too weak to hold themselves up, really. So these bones are very soft and bowed. Sometimes it can heal with age, but I found at least one young woman in the Huntington collection who was in her late teens, early 20s, who displayed evidence of childhood rickets. So again, even though I'm looking at her skeleton at the end of her life much later, this tells me something about her childhood. And put in this context, I can likely assume that, her case of rickets is due to these societal circumstances wherein Black children leave slavery. They also leave the South where there is a lot more sunlight, so your body can synthesize vitamin D on its own. A lot of folks move north looking for jobs, hoping to escape racism, although you're still going to encounter it. And they're working indoors, they're not getting sunlight, you're not getting safe, you're not eating a lot of seafood, you're not going to end up with a lot of vitamin D, and these children end up with rickets. On the right, tuberculosis. So this is a severe case of what we call Pott's disease or spinal tuberculosis, which is the most common form tuberculosis takes when it affects the skeleton. So it's oftentimes confined to your lungs, but it can move throughout the body and affect your joints. So what happens is tuberculosis ends up in your vertebra, causing them to collapse or kyphose, and your back ends up with this characteristic sort of hunch in it that's called Pott's disease. And again, about half of the Black women in the Huntington collection died of tuberculosis. And I also identified one woman who I believe did suffer from spinal tuberculosis and had Pott's disease. But what I'd like to end on is not necessarily such this miserable note or sad note. I often find my research being very depressing and hard to do, but I'd like to offer some ways forward, not only just considering how we can read through archives and actually, understand what Black people and women or marginalized groups were going through and how it came to be, put into medical and scientific literature, or how it influenced our decisions to curate their remains. I want to, take this a step further and think about how we can do our research moving forward. So this wonderful book that I'm putting here to make a plug for everyone to please read, Catherine McKittrick's Dear Science. In this book, one of her main points is that when we do research, we often start from objectified and dead Black bodies. And me as a bioarchaeologist, I'm literally starting from an objectified, curated, dead Black body that's in parts. But what's important is that when we find these sorts of results, so if I say, yes, half of these women died from tuberculosis, most of them died in, public institutions, they were poor, et cetera, et cetera. McKittrick argues that we often describe Black death and degradation as legitimate scholarly findings. And instead, we need to move past this sort of positivist, biocentric approach and think of other ways to tell this history and these stories. And so in my case, I want to know, where racism and early physical anthropology and medicine are coming from. And so when I do my research, I'm going to acknowledge this history and face it head on rather than trying to hide it. It's really important to know the history of your disciplines and what implications your methodology might have. So if I choose to say, measure a cranium, with these measurements that were perfected by folks like Ales Hurlichka, or and maybe you've heard of the Samuel G. Morton. He has a cranial collection at UPenn. Every time I do that, that's an action that comes from somewhere that we should really think about. And I'm not saying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. What I'm saying is that when we do our research, we need to really contextualize it. So instead of simply saying, Annie died in childbirth and Black women are still dying in childbirth, I hope you saw how I'm weaving this thread of this long history that makes it seem like we've always died in childbirth for natural reasons, when that's not the case. Don't think that, like these diseases and discrepancies in racialized health, say like high blood pressure or right now COVID, these are not things that are necessarily inherent in anyone's genes. These are things that are made by our society in the places that we are. And when we do historical research, especially, we should be pointing out how these myths were made and how they're maintained, and the ways that our research might be misconstrued to maintain these sorts of narratives. And finally, this is, for those of us who are anthropologists or folks working with, people directly, we should consider the role of what Jen Lupu, a great dear friend who's a historical archaeologist, calls ethical stakeholders. So we should be thinking about the communities who might be affected by our research, who share a common place in society with those who we are studying. So if I'm studying Black women, what does this mean for Black women today? And not just me, I can't speak for all Black women. And so think about these wider ways that you might involve people, or how you might use your research to help a community and make sure you're not causing harm. And so finally, I just want to thank the Medical Heritage Library for this wonderful fellowship, and also the Smithsonian Institution for funding my dissertation research and giving me access to the Huntington collection. Thank you.
Many, many thanks, Asia and Dr. Lands. I go back and forth. We talk Asia, so yeah. So Asia, many thanks for this presentation. It is wonderful to see the ways that you've been weaving the primary sources from the time period and the archaeological, the remains that you have carefully, examined and trying, and the birth records from different archives, and trying to create trying to bring forth the stories that you see in the bodies of the women that you've been looking at. So just really thank you for this presentation. For everyone who's attending the presentation, you saw in the chat, we've had a very active chat. Asia, as part of the Medical Heritage Library, has developed a set related to, sorry, I'm just bringing up the top, give me one second. I'm sorry about this, Asia. I had it set down and I just put it elsewhere. There we go. Anti-Black racism in medicine. So we have both Asia's set, and we're still tweaking it, so please don't mind us. And we, which includes not only some of her readings into different diseases and eugenics and other things, but the sources that she was able to find in the Medical Heritage Library, which are open and freely available to everyone. So not only do we have Asia's wonderful set, we also have a Roots of Racism set. We'll combine in with Asia's set. So you are welcome to take a look at both of them as you, if you want to dive into the primary resources and see what you can come up with. At this point, I want to make sure we open this up for questions. We've had a number of different things, Asia, in the chat related to where J. Marion Sims materials may be. Thank you for that. I see multiple references there. There is a question from one of our audience saying, I would be very interested in discussing the choice of identifying the individuals only by their first name. We've had similar discussions in naming of Nazi and Holocaust victims, and ultimately decided that we need to fully restore name and biography to fully acknowledge the victim's dignity and remember them. So do you want to comment a little more on that?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Right now, biological anthropology and a lot of museum anthropology is kind of having a reckoning where folks are being forced to acknowledge that we have some really problematic specimens in our museum collections. And a lot of this would have started, well, long before this, but in 1990, the United States passes NAGPRA, which is the Native Americans Graves Protection Repatriation Act, which required any institutions that receive federal funding to return remains that could be known for affiliated and federally recognized tribal groups. So there's a lot of holes in there. And this was met with a lot of pushback from biological anthropologists who said we were losing science. So of course, we're prioritizing our Western way of knowing over other ways of knowing, etc. And so recently, this has become an issue, especially when we're talking about the remains of Black folks. And so you may have seen a couple years, oh my gosh, sorry, COVID has skewed my sense of time. But you know, at UPenn, they had the remains of victims of the MOVE bombing. So a 1985 state violence police bombing against, you know, a revolutionary interracial group that killed children. And these remains were kept and they were used for teaching while the parents of these children are still in prison. Okay. So that was, you know, one of these things. I'm at Harvard now, where we're currently, you know, working on figuring out what's in the collections at the Peabody that, you know, could be linked to slavery in particular. And so in the case of these identified skeletal collections, most people were never actually interested in their names. Like, so if you see the research that's being done on these collections, it's usually for like forensic anthropology in particular, where it's like, oh, I'm working on aging, I'm working on sexing, I'm working on stature, or whatever. Here I'd like to point out that most of these collections did indeed come from very impoverished people. Humans have changed dramatically in the past century, especially when it comes to things like height. So I don't know why the expectation is that we would be making, you know, all of these methods that are useful and applicable to modern day forensic cases in every context. So there, I could talk about that all day. So basically, more recently, some of us were like, wait a minute, you know, where did you get these collections from? And you know who these people are, like, why aren't we using this information? And so part of my agreement was, you know, you can have this information, but like you keep it to yourself and you're taking their names off so that you can't, like, someone can't trace them back. However, I'm very happy to say that the Smithsonian has formed a new panel, and I was part of a working group to discuss things that they might do going forward. Because I believe that a lot of this fear of not using names is that descendants might want their ancestors back, and they're scared of repatriation all over again. Like, oh, we're going to lose these two. We lost all of our indigenous remains. Now we're losing, you know, everyone else. But instead of viewing this as losing something, this is, I would argue, gaining something and being able to actually tell these people's histories, and also rebuilding trust with communities, especially say the Black community, because we've you know, held on to these for so long and kept them hidden like they're, you know, these bad things to be ashamed of. But what I always say to folks who have these remains and these collections is, you know, you're not responsible for what Ales Herlichka did, you know, 100 years ago. You are responsible for what you choose to do and whether or not you want to take an ethical standpoint. And so, yes, I argue for the use of names, and particular with Black folks, especially, you know, the history of naming, you know, we couldn't name ourselves when we were enslaved. And so I would argue that taking away names of Black people in particular in death is just further violence. Yeah.
Asia, more questions coming in. So yeah, easier. Let's start with an easier one. Your dissertation, is it available through Syracuse, or is it available online in any way, shape, or form?
So I put my dissertation on like the 2-year embargo because I'm working on a book.
Okay.
However, quite a bit of my dissertation is actually already publications, like journal length publications. And I put them and a couple edited volumes, and they should all be on my ResearchGate, so that you can download them without a paywall.
Okay.
And I have a Google Scholar page too that will link to them.
Thank you. So next one, thank you for your excellent talk. I recently assigned your feminist anthro paper to my students. We had a great discussion from one of our audience members. So 2 questions arose from that. I know that this is a talk on archives, but what lessons can we transfer to bioarchaeological studies of people for whom archival records do not exist? And do you think your work could ultimately connect some of the women to their living descendants in ways that would benefit the descendants?
Oh yeah, so these are really good questions. So I'm actually now working on some individuals who we don't have archival, like a lot of archival things. And this is really varies case by case and what you have. So there's a couple projects I'm tackling that we hopefully will be using stable isotopic analysis, such as strontium, which if you have a general idea of where someone might be from, it matches up to groundwater that was taken in during their childhood. I'm not a stable isotopic analysis expert. I hope to become one over the next year, but there's a lot of information on this. And that's used it is destructive, but the technology has advanced so far that it just requires drilling into a tooth. So that's one way where you can try to track someone down based on like location, rather than reducing it to, racial groups, which there is sort of a risk if you're doing aDNA. Like you may be able to find population affinity, but that can be very messy and there are ethical considerations to take in. So like, for example, right now I'm working on remains that are like, was donated by so-and-so, they said they found it here. And so it's, looking at the remains, maybe seeing if I can figure out if there's like any, obvious markers that would tell me like, maybe this person died from this or what have you. But it's really been going back through the museum archives and then tracing down old institutions and people and figuring out where those people worked, where they collected specimens, trying to figure out, where the remains came from. And we're still working on this. So Harvard has an entire committee for focusing on skeletal remains that they formed recently. And so it's like this really large interdisciplinary like effort that's being led to try to come up with ethical solutions for remains like this. And I can't give you a simple answer because I think it varies with, every specimen. But to the Black women, yes, there are the women in this collection, the Black women in Huntington, there are some women I'm positive I would be able to find their descendants. The thing is though, that I try to keep in mind is, I don't know, like, how would you feel if someone contacts you out of the blue and says, I have your great, whatever's remains, and this is what happened to them. It could be a really good thing and a healing thing, but I also have to keep in mind that that could also be a really painful thing that maybe you don't want to know about. And so this is also something that I've really been like thinking through and struggling with. Like, so if we do find someone's descendants, how do you go about telling them in a way that's not just causing more stress and harm and trauma? Because unfortunately, I do feel that no matter what, when you're talking about these really sensitive topics, especially as they relate to like enslavement in the United States, that does cause stress for any Black people who are told. So I would welcome suggestions on that, or folks who have worked on similar things, that how you might approach it or how you think it should be done. Yeah.
Asia, this actually let's tie this next question into this. From another audience member, I would like to ask Dr. Lands for her take on applying this research to wet specimen collections. I have created contextual narratives for some of the quote unquote specimens to learn about who they were, how they died, and why their body parts were returned. So do you have just some commentary or some greater sense of how this might be applied more broadly?
I think you could essentially do the same thing. So like, I know, for example, that there actually may still be some wet specimens from the Huntington collection at the National Museum of Health and Medicine. So like, again, you have these people's names. So what I did for the Huntington collection in particular is I had names, I tracked down death certificates. You can find their like cause of death. Some of them have last known addresses. Some might even have a contact. That, someone who they knew at their time of death. And so like, you can essentially do the same thing if you have the same starting information. You could find their cause of death or where they were dissected, and then maybe you can figure out why they would have kept that specimen. There might be a reason there. It's like they had this disease, they were this sort of person, so we had to keep it. The other thing though, however, is like in the case of the skeletons in the Huntington collection, when it was originally founded by Dr. George Sumner Huntington, he had this goal of just making a massive like morphological comparative collection. So originally he may have wanted, it was something like 5,000 of each bone in the human body. So he would keep anyone. It didn't matter. Like he didn't have this set reason. The other thing was, while he was still alive, he would trade. Like Herlichka would send him wet specimens, he'd send him bones, they'd switch things back and forth. So the other thing is, you might have kept a specimen, particularly because you were studying that part of the body or you knew someone who was. And so they had requested that you like send them as many specimens of whatever it was as you can. So there'd be a whole variety of reasons why you would keep wet specimens. Yeah.
And in the chat, I just noticed, thank you, Kitty. The question of potentially contacting people just came up in a talk yesterday by Sydney Halpern about her new book, Dangerous Medicine. So this is,
Ooh.
Yeah, it's like, take a look, you grab that one, Asia. There's another question as I'm going through these that another audience member, this was an awesome presentation, thank you so much. Will the women who were identified be acknowledged in some way? Saying in report, remembering their names is so important, and they say thank you very much.
I don't know. I remember them, but in an official way, I would hope so.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the least we could do. And not only, so the thing is, like, obviously I'm a scientist, I'm embedded in my certain social whatever, I ask specific questions for a reason. Obviously, I'm interested in the experiences of Black women because I'm a Black woman. There are many other people in this collection who I would say they deserve the same respect. So, you know, no matter what their racial designation or origin or something, I do think we should be acknowledging the fact that they did contribute their bodies to science unwillingly. So nowadays, I know a lot of medical schools, like when you're done with your anatomy class, they still have like those, you know, the funerals and whatever, and you thank these people for their contributions. And, you know, most biological anthropologists, yes, it's like we always have like our little, if you're in the lab, you have to treat the remains with respect, you do like X, Y, and Z. And I think most of us have our own ways of trying to acknowledge and honor these people, but I do think it should be more public. We've done it, I would argue, behind closed doors for too long, keeping our archives hidden. And it's created too much distrust and too much tension that I think we have a lot of work to do to repair those links to wider communities. And if that does mean acknowledging these people, repatriating those who we can find an appropriate place to send them, whatever, like that's what we should be doing, I think.
And in the chat, it's saying audience member says some European museums have started to acknowledge the individuals from where from whom the specimens came from. So you're seeing that as well. Another question that came up: how can we learn more about the Smithsonian's Working Group on Human Remains? Is there a point of contact?
So right now it's small. They may be growing it eventually, so I don't want to like inundate someone with a bunch of emails. However, so right now, wonderful person, Dr. Sabrina Schultz, is in charge of the skeletal collections right now. But hopefully going forward, we'll be like actually putting out more things on that, so that it's very early in its, you know, formation right now. But I am happy that they're doing something. So like, again, it's frustrating being a member of a community where it's like, we've waited 400 plus years for things. And when I'm like, oh, we're going to have to wait a little longer. But at the same time, I think that this sort of work and progress is at this moment in time worth waiting for once we start making these like inroads and moves. So once you've formed a group of people or you have an idea that you're going to take the initiative on something, I think it should be done slowly. Here I'll make my case for slow science. Everyone should read Another Science is Possible by Isabel Stengers. But we need to do this slowly and carefully and be very considerate. And so yeah, I'm glad that there's working groups. There's one here at Harvard, again at the Smithsonian, and that's with Dr. Schultz, like I said. But yeah, hopefully there will be more out public like soon.
Asia, a question, as you were doing your research in the Medical Heritage Library collection, what challenges did you face trying to surface materials related to race?
A lot. My biggest thing that I would do is search for words like in the library, and I would search so the way it's set up on Internet Archive, you can search the actual text of items and such. Um, or you can search like the tags, or you can search the titles, what have you. I would actually search the text for certain words or phrases. So the biggest ones where I would search for Negro, I'd search for slave, I'd search for like Negro slave, various. And so again, that was part of that whole having to you have to be aware that you're gonna have to like look for really offensive terms at times. Like recently I was doing research and I was like, oh no, I have to search for mulatto or something, you know. So it was really searching by like words and phrases in the search feature. And then you know, when resources popped up, you know, doing a quick look at what they were and seeing if they would apply to the topic and setting them aside so that I could like go through and see if they fit what I was looking for. Um, so yeah, it was usually, and also if there were, I also had a lot of like starting points. For example, I knew rickets was a highly racialized disease at a certain period in time. So I would find resources on rickets from, you know, certain time periods and then search within them to see if they did mention Black or Negro or what have you. So there were a few different ways to go about it. Or like when I was looking for Sims, there's a really nifty feature on our Internet Archive where the Medical Heritage Library resources are, where you can actually, you know, search by authors. And so like it was a variety of having, like, I had a lot of background in this from doing this sort of research from this time period. So it was taking things that I was used to seeing and then seeing if they popped up in these medical sources.
I recognize we are running low on time. The chat has basically been talking about the American Association for Anatomy and their task force, and related to legacy collections and task force on racism. I'm seeing a reference to some articles as well. So I hope everyone can just join in the chat as well and reap those resources as you go along. But at this point, I think we'll wrap up. And again, I want to thank you, Asia, so much for your presentation, for this very stimulating question and answer period. This is for our audience, this is being recorded and we'll make this available on the Medical Heritage Library website. But if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to us at the Medical Heritage Library, or reach out to Asia as well. She's quite a wonderful person. Thank you, Asia, again, so much. So have a good rest of your day. Have a lovely weekend, everybody, and thank you.
Thank you. Bye.